do in the winter?
Hello and welcome to the fourth in these episodes from the Isles of Mull, Iona, Ulva and Gomatra. I'm Alistair Satchell. I live outside of Dervig in the north of Mull and I'll be your host today. In this episode I talk with Ann Cleave. Anne and her husband Colin moved to Mull in the late 90s and ran Round and About, a local newspaper, and published the Red Book, her local phone book, amongst many other things. Our conversation goes into Anne's life here, her working life before coming to Mull, the Salon show, being the archivist at Duart Castle, and her studies with the Open University after retiring. Anne also talks about the death of her sister, Elsie Frost, who was murdered when she was a teenager. You can find this section at about half an hour into the episode. I'd like to thank Anne again for her willingness and ability to talk about the loss of her sister. When we come to talk about Merlin and Arthurian matters in the later part of the podcast, I struggle to remember the name of a play supposedly associated with Shakespeare. The name of the play is The Birth of Merlin, and on further research, it's unlikely that Shakespeare had anything to do with it, but it's counted amongst possible collaborations, sort of. There are links and more on the website for many of the topics we talk about. I'll be back at the end to say a couple more things and round off. Without further ado, Ann Cleave. Who are you?
I'm Ann Cleave, and known as Anne of Cleves to a lot of people on Mull, for obvious reasons.
And how long have you been on Mull?
Just over 22 years.
What brought you here? So that's going back 22 years, that's sort of 1996. What brought you to Mull in the first place?
Interesting story. I worked for the museum service in Portsmouth, and I was the trading officer. So I looked after the trading operation in 7 different museum shops, which ranged from Charles Dickens' Birthplace Museum to the D-Day Museum, Southsea Castle, where Henry had been standing when he saw the Mary Rose go down. We had a Natural History Museum, we had a Beam Engine Museum, and we had the Cabinet War Rooms under Portsdown Hill. So I created all the merchandise for selling in the shops. So the merchandise was as individual to the museum as it could be. So we had the D-Day Museum, and in the D-Day Museum there is the Overlord embroidery, which is a very long embroidery which tells the story of the events leading up to D-Day on the 6th of June in 1944. So there were lots and lots of books about the military aspect of D-Day, but there was nothing for the ladies who went around the museum and who were looking at the embroidery. They didn't know that that little piece of material that was Montgomery's cap actually came from Montgomery's cap. So I thought we really do need a book about the Overlord embroidery from its historical aspect, from its craft aspect. So I spoke to a friend of mine who was he was an agent, he was a literary agent, and I said to him, Vernon, who can you recommend for me to write the textile history of the Overlord embroidery? And he said, how about Eve Eckstein?
Oh my goodness. So
the nice thing about Eve Eckstein was that she didn't live too far away from us. She lived in Harrow at the time, and we were going through we took Eve on to do the job, and eventually we got to publication, and Colin and I had done the index, because at that point I belonged to the Society of Indexes as well, and because it was quite an academic book, it needed a proper index. So Eve said to me one day, I really ought to pay you for doing the index, she said, as co-author with Stephen, who was our military historian. And I said, well, you can't. I said, I can't accept any payment because I work for the museum service and Portsmouth City Council don't allow me to take payments. Well, she said, I can pay you in kind. So I said, oh yes, what kind is that then? So she said, I have a house on Mull. She says, and you can go and stay in my house for 2 weeks, twice a year, for 2 years. So I said, done.
That's fantastic.
That's a great story, isn't it? Anyway, we came up to Mull the first time in 1995, I think it was. And we drove off the boat and we turned right, heading towards Saarland to come through to Toloisk. And before we got to Saarland, we knew we were going to be here one day permanently. We just knew. And Colin was as enthusiastic as I was, so it was really nice. So we enjoyed our free holidays at Toastery. And during that time, we decided we'd get married here in Tobermory. So in August 1988, we got married in Tobermory. And James McNabb, who was the registrar at the time, said to us both, "You two are so wrapped up in each other, you'll have to make sure that you don't become reclusive." So we said, "Oh, yeah, all right." And we decided at this point that it wouldn't be a good idea just to come and retire here. We wanted to be able to give something to the community. So Eve rang us up one day and she said, "I've got something to tell you, I've got something to tell you." She says, "You've got to come up and meet the girls who were selling Mull laser print." And at that point, Mull laser print was publishing Round and About, and it had started the Red Book, or it had revived the Red Book, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. And it did all sorts of things like the Highland Games literature, all the stuff for Saarland Show, all the stuff for Benessen, and lots of small jobbing printing. So we hit it really well off with Erica and Brenda, and we bought the business and we bought the house. We sold our house in Middlesex, and that was us on our way to Mull. So that's the story of how we came to Mull, which was quite a nice story, yeah.
And how did you meet Colin?
Museum again. I had separated from my husband at that point, and I was feeling quite vulnerable. And one day, one of the curators said to me, "Anne, there's a really nice man working down in the gallery. Would you take him a cup of tea and a biscuit?" So I said, "No, thank you." So she said, "Oh, come on, Anne." She said, "The man's working really hard. Just take him a cup of tea and a biscuit." And I said, "No, Penny, N-O, no. Watch my lips." Anyway, she wheedled and wheedled and wheedled, and eventually I went downstairs with a tray with 2 cups of coffee on it and 2 biscuits. Nice. And that was me meeting Colin. He'd designed and he was installing a new exhibition display system in one of the galleries at the City Museum and Art Gallery. So that was how we met. And he had a long history of working in museums and art galleries because he was a design engineer, and he designed display systems and galleries, and he worked in banks, and he would often be found doing a job in the Bank of England at night. Yes. He was stopped on more than one occasion by a policeman who said, "And where is your car, sir?" As Colin was getting out of the car. "Oh, is this your car, sir?" Colin would say yes. And the policeman would say to him, "And what are you doing here in the city at this time of night?" "I'm doing a job at the Bank of England." And the policeman would often go, "Ha, ha, ha," up his sleeve. But Colin would be installing demountable partition systems to divide officers up and all that kind of thing. So he'd worked all the way up and down the whole of the UK and in Isle of Man. He did all sorts of things, so yes. So our 2 sets of interests met really well. So, and we did become very close friends.
Fantastic. Doing the maths there, it sounds like Eve got a bargain out of you. You didn't? Did you even get the two years of holidays?
Yes, we did.
Right.
Yeah, we did. But he did get the bargain because I paid for the marriage licence. And he would often say to me, "If ever you're short of cash, I can lend you 6 shillings," which he assumed was the cost of the marriage licence. And I would always ring him and say, "You still owe me for that. You still owe me for that." So.
And if we were to go back to kind of the start of your own life, what was the story of your parents? Where did they come from? Where were they based?
Well, they were based. They lived in Wakefield in Yorkshire, West Riding, and I had always thought that my family were Yorkshire all the way through. But I discovered that my mother's forebears came from the northeast, and they were miners, and they moved down from the northeast down into West Yorkshire for better mining opportunities. And my father's forebears came from London. And I'm struggling a little bit with the ancestry on that side because I'm looking for a man called Henry Frost, who was born in a particular year. And at the moment, I've found 5 of them. 5 Henry Frost. So he might have been a musician's porter, a harp maker's porter. Wow. Or he might have been a piano maker's porter, or he might have been a book porter. I don't know quite which one yet. I rather like the idea of the harp maker's porter. I think.
Very nice.
And they moved north in the Industrial Revolution. So that was how my immediate family ended up in Yorkshire, my grandparents on both sides. My father's father was an agricultural labourer, and his mother looked after the children. My mother's father was a miner, and grandma looked after their children. And they were all in and around that area of Wakefield, which includes Normanton and Alltofts. And so that's where we all started out.
It's interesting, my family, Satchel is a very unusual name. There's not very many of us at all, although we've tried to increase by 1. Looking back in our family history, we know that they were in London. My great-grandfather was in London, and my grandfather as well was in London, in Lambeth, of all places.
Yeah, that's where my lot were. Yeah, Lambeth, yeah.
There's some amazing archive footage on the BFI's site of Lambeth in the early 1900s, which is really worth looking at. You see the level of poverty of the children, and it's filmed during the day, so it's mostly kids that are kicking about, actually, and it's very, very interesting. But if my auntie looked into it a little bit more, and most of the satchels she could find were in court records. And yeah, exactly, and it's like, oh, they all seem to be on the wrong side of the dock. But no idea for what. It could have been for stealing a loaf of bread, the classic thing, or it could have been so we don't really know much about where the satchels came from at all, which is kind of curious. Anyway, you've already got the skills of indexing. That must have been quite useful when you came to Mull.
It's been useful throughout all my life because it gave me I had the skill of being able to sort things. I could file. I knew how to put things in order. I knew how to retrieve stuff. So you were able to do research, retrieve documents. So the indexing was a really good and sound basis for doing lots and lots of other things. So I didn't use it very much, but I did once get an award for a good index, which was quite nice.
And when you came to Mull, so you took over the business of Mull Laser Print. That kind of dates it.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Well, tell me, what had existed before the Red Book? Are you aware of what came before?
Yes, George Sassoon, who lived down at Loch Buoy, he had... I don't know whether he'd done it on his own, but he'd created a little green telephone directory for Mull, just in a little A5 format, and but it had come into disuse. It had fallen out. It wasn't printed anymore, although I have got a copy of George's little green one. But Erica and Brenda decided it would be a good idea to revive it, and so they did revive it. And it was basically just a residential directory with a little bit of advertising in it as well to support the expense of producing it. So when we took it on, Colin loved the idea of the Red Book, and it appealed to his sense of order. Being an engineer, everything was very ordered. So he developed a little bit further to the extent that he put postcodes in the back of it. He put a business index in, alphabetical index, and he really worked very hard on it. He would go up to the council officers once every 3 years to check who had passed away so that he could take them out of the book. We never took any third-party references because we came a cropper once when somebody said, "You haven't got so-and-so in the Red Book." And Colin said, "Oh, have you got the information then?" So, yes. So we were given the name and the telephone number of this person. And then when the book was published, we had a phone call from said person who said, "My number is X directory."
Oh, no.
You shouldn't be in there. So he was quite upset. Yeah. So after that, Colin only ever put entries in that were verified by the telephone subscriber. So, but yeah, I mean, he, even after he'd retired, because he was 65 the year after we moved to Mull, and he carried on working for a very long time into his early 80s. The Red Book was just a joy for him to do. He just loved doing it, you know. And he would drive around and people would say, "Oh, new edition of the Red Book, can I have one?" you know. And they'd give him the money in his hand and he'd hand them over a Red Book, you know. So he got to know quite a lot of people like that.
I know for me, coming here from being away, I felt like I'd really made a commitment to living here when I got in the Red Book.
Yes, it's a shame in a way, because a lot of people don't realise that it isn't an automatic way of getting in. You have to
It's a
contact.
select club.
Yeah, because it's not like the BT book, which is automatically includes all its subscribers. People have to elect to be in the Red Book, and I sometimes look in the Red Book and I think, oh darn it, they're not in the Red Book. I wish everybody was in the Red Book. So yes, somebody once told Colin that it was required reading for any visitor to Mull, required bedtime reading for any visitor to Mull, because it's got so much information in it.
It was actually Georgia that told me you should get your details into the Red Book. I thought, and Georgia was my girlfriend at the time and now my wife, and it was quite like, oh, can I be part of that club? Should I? And yeah, so when I first went in, I think it was just my mobile, because I was kind of between so many different houses. I think we're now in with our house number. I need to check that. Yeah, I need to see.
Yeah, I mean that was one of Colin's innovations, was to include people's mobile numbers if they wanted.
That's a brilliant way to do it, because it makes a lot, especially around here, because people, you know, the nature of housing is that people don't always have a house that they're in. They can move from summer let to winter let to on and on and on. Right, yeah. It makes a difference. Yeah.
And of course the beauty of it was we had it printed away. And so that was why there was a new edition every third year. But eventually, Colin thought it would be more practical to print the contents at home and just have the covers printed away. So that meant that he would amend it on a daily basis. So if he got somebody sent him an email today. He would amend it on the system, and if somebody sent him an email next week, he would amend it on the system, and then the very next time that he printed the contents, which he did to order for the shops, it would be as up to date as it possibly could be.
That's fantastic.
And it meant that even if people changed their mobile numbers, you know, it was still up to date.
You had email addresses in there as well, is that right?
No, we didn't have. He decided that email addresses at that point were a bit of a difficulty, because people had lots, and people changed them more often than they changed their phone numbers, you know, their mobile numbers. So he decided he wouldn't. But we'd talked to one or two people who said they thought that it would be good to have the Red Book online, and that would have been an opportunity then to put people's email addresses in an online edition. So, but because the technicalities of publishing the Red Book meant that you could only have a certain number of you had to increase it in 4-page units. And so if you weren't careful, you would end up with lots of empty pages until you gradually fill them up. And he used to adjust the leading and you know, the type size for some things, or he'd contract words, just to make it all fit within the page until he had enough information that he could put in another 4 pages. And I think it grew from, I think it was 24 pages to something like 36 pages in. So, that used to be a nightmare, people's nicknames. And people would say to us, "Oh, well, you just need to ask whoever it was." "Oh, well, who is it?" You know, so we gradually learned people's nicknames, and yes, it would have been a good idea to put nicknames in on a special page. I think that would have been brilliant. Yeah, I think there might be 1 or 2 people who would have preferred not to have their names in.
When you came here, you had Mull Laser Print. What else did you do with the company as well? Did you carry on the association with Sal and Show?
Oh yes. The other thing that we did, the other thing that we bought when we bought the business was we ran the secretariat for both the Chamber of Commerce and Holiday Mull. So Colin and I were very much involved with Holiday Mall and the Chamber of Commerce from day one, because it was part of the service that the business provided, was the secretariat work for both of those organisations. We continued to do Benesson show for quite a while, but we always stayed connected very closely with Sarlen Show, and we were both pretty passionate about Sarlen Show, and now I'm trophy secretary and look after 80 trophies. So and that work with Barbara Weir, who was secretary for so many years, was a really great foundation, because what Barbara didn't know about Sarlen Show was not worth knowing. And she passed all that information very generously on to Colin and I. And so we knew that the workings of the show right from Barbara, from the roots, if you like. So that stood us in good stead for the show.
Duncan McGilp, who I interviewed the other day, talked about the trophy that he gave, which had been in his family.
Yeah, the McGilp Medal, yes. It's awarded for the best Highland bull. And I thought, oh, that's a wonderful award. And he gave it into the care of Donald McGilvery at Pennygown, and Donald asked Charlie Hogg to make a mount for it. So it's mounted in a beautiful piece of wood and standing on a wooden mount as well. And it went to Tom Nelson at Glengorm for his Highland bull, which is an absolutely beautiful animal. Yeah, so it's a really lovely one. Well done to Duncan. And I think it may well be that as a result of Duncan's medal coming back to the show, I think we might have another one coming back as well. But we've had some interesting returns this last year or so, because this year also we've had the Salem Businessmen's Trophy, which has not been seen since the beginning of the 20th century. And we also had the Alexander Duncan Cup, which is a little Britannia metal cup, known as pewter, also known as pewter. And that was awarded to Alexander Duncan, who was the farm manager at Duart/Torresay Farm, and that had not been seen since 1895. And even researching in the museum, I've not been able to find out what it was awarded to him for. It's just got his name on it, and there's nothing in the minute books that tell me why the Alexander Duncan Cup was awarded to him. I know that he was a very active member, and he went to committee meetings when they were held in Oban all those years ago. So we present that one to the best overall dog in the show, which is a nice one.
Did the Sallen Show, did it grow out of the meetings that they used to have kind of halfway down the glen there? Do you know how it started?
Oh, you mean the cattle fair, the fair?
The fair.
Yeah. I don't really know, but I would imagine it did. I haven't done a history of the show. That might be a good idea, actually. I've got a very good friend, Hilary Peel, who will be known by a lot of people, who is a very, very good historian and writer. Right. And it might be a nice idea to collude with Hilary and do a history of Sallen Show. I think that would be very interesting. Yeah, so I imagine that it would have been something to do with the fair. It's always been a good thing for breeders to have awards for their stock, because it helps them to sell. So, and I think that was always the objective. So right from early days. Yeah, so it just shows, doesn't it, how far back it goes. I think we had, 150 years of the show about 2 years ago. So it's really quite a long-standing show.
That's fantastic. Yeah. How have you got into working with particularly Duart? What's that?
The Duart Castle archive thing came about as a result of my involvement with the Historical Society. When we first came to Mull, we joined Mull Historical Society, and there was a tiny conflict with Mull Historical Society in the form of Colin McIntyre. Oh, yeah. Because people kept ringing me up as Secretary of the Historical Society and asking me if they could make a booking for his next gig. It upset one or two of the older members. As a result, we changed the name of the Historical Society to Mull Historical and Archaeological Society. And Sir Lauchlan's father had been the patron of the society, right. And we asked Sir Lauchlan to continue his patronship of the society, which he agreed to do. And we held an event at Duart Castle once a year. But I think Sir Lachlan knew that I was interested in archiving, and he just rang me up one day and he said, there's quite a lot of stuff here that needs to be archived and I'd like you to do it. So I said, okay, that's fine. And I said I would work until I was 70. Well, that's a bit of history in itself now. At the moment it's difficult because there's so much work being done on the castle. Yeah. All the available space is being used to store family things from the private living accommodation. Yeah. So I've not been able to do very much, and with Colin being ill for the last couple of years as well, that put it sort of slowed things down a little bit. So I'm hoping to get back into the full swing of that once that area of the castle's been completed and I can get back into the archive room. But there's a huge amount to do.
In terms of the treasures that you found in there, what has particularly stood out for you? No, I don't mean treasure in the sense of gold glittering things, but...
No, my favourite, there are a couple of things which are favourites. One is, it was a little watercolour sketch pad by, I think it was one of Sir Lachlan's aunts. Yeah. And that had been broken down into separate sheets, and it had just been put into an ordinary plastic photograph album, and I can sense Georgia shrieking inside at that because it's these lovely little watercolours are in plastic sleeves, which is no good for them at all. But even better than that, these are beautiful, they're really beautiful little watercolours, are Sir Charles's diaries. And there's dozens and dozens of Charles's diaries. And so Not only do they want to be archived and catalogued because they're diaries, but at some time they need to be transcribed as well. Yeah. And the whole object of doing the Duart Castle archive will be to make it available to as wide a public as possible. So digitisation is sort of looming.
And was Sir Charles the one that kind of refurbished the castle and opened it up to the public?
Yes, I think I'm right in saying that. In the late 19th century, Duart Castle was a complete tumbled ruin. Yeah. Absolutely nothing there apart from piles of stones. And it was redesigned and rebuilt leading up to about 1913. And it was beautifully and sensitively done, and the architect, whose name escapes me just at the moment, had also designed the pillars that hold up Sydney Harbour Bridge, and Duart Castle was his only ancient building that he'd ever worked on. Right. So that was a very interesting thing. But the problems that are at the castle today are as a result of work that was done in the 1950s when the wrong materials were used for renovation and restoration. So the conservation stonemason, Andrew Bradley, has had to remove an awful lot of the material that was used in the 1950s because it was just concrete, or it was the wrong kind of stuff. Anyway, it should have been lime mortar, but they didn't know. They thought they were doing the right thing, but it has caused huge problems everywhere throughout the whole of the castle with water ingress. So that's why the scaffolding's been up there for so long, because it's a long, slow, tedious process.
What kind of lime are they using? Are they using kind of...
hot lime.
Okay.
I think it's hot lime, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's... the architect, whose name is Martin Hadlington, they had the original lime analysed, and the original recipe was used, which is what we did on Moy Castle as well. Fantastic. When we were doing the renovation or stabilisation work on Moy Castle, the mortar was analysed, and the conservation stonemason had made the lime mortar to the original recipe. So we know that it was, yeah. So we've just got a little bit more work to do on Moy Castle at the moment. Right. We've got funding in place for doing the entrance steps and the door area. There's a broken lintel above the door. Yeah. But our monumental stonemason, Andrew Bradley, had an accident at Duart and he's off work at the moment. So we hope he'll be back soon.
I was actually that, yeah. Moy is a fascinating castle as well. What have you found being there? Is there anything? I mean, that the oubliette there is a terrifying thing.
It is a very interesting building, and it's unique in that it has cross-barrel vaulting. So on the ground floor, the barrel vaulting goes in one direction, and on the next floor up it goes in the opposite direction. So hence it's called cross barrel vaulting.
Was that for strength?
It must have been for strength. It's also got a bottle dungeon, which is just big enough and deep enough to hold one man. And Jim told me a story. Jim Corbett, who owns the Lochbury estate and therefore the castle, one of his dogs fell down the hole, and Jim had to get down into the bottle dungeon to get his dog out, which can't have been much fun. It's also got a very interesting well, which is always full of fresh water, and we do not know how or where this fresh water comes from, because the water surrounding the castle, or on 3 sides of it, is seawater. Still don't know where the fresh water comes from that's in the well. But it's nice because our local metal worker, Philippe Regal, has made all the barriers and the covers and everything, so that was nice, all beautifully done. So it's now safe to walk around the castle. You still need a guide, because it's a hard hat area, so we can provide a hard hat and people can make an appointment and get taken around the castle.
We went down last summer, I think it was. It was about a year ago, and we were doing some filming down there, and Col, my son, loved it. He thought it was fantastic, and both he and Georgia had a truffle round the castle. I was outside filming, just kind of moody shots looking upwards and things, but he was over the moon.
Col would have been interested to know that it's got cave spiders. And these are, from my understanding, they're a species of spider that only live in very dark, damp caves. But they're in Moy Castle, and they're very long-legged, and they've got their eye structure is enlarged so they can see in the dark. But they move really, really slowly. When we were surveying the inside of the castle, there was a huge cobweb in one corner, and there was this cave spider climbing up. It almost looked as if it needed, pitons and a rope and all the rest of it. But Cole would have been interested in that. Yes.
If it's okay to come on to the story of your sister, could you explain to us what the story of your sister was like?
Well, my sister was 4 years younger than me, and very, very bright girl. She'd been elected to be head girl at school, and I think I think I'm reasonably bright, but I think it's a fairly well acknowledged fact that my sister was a lot brighter than me. But the sad thing was that she died in very unhappy and tragic circumstances when she was 14. She was murdered, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and she'd been teaching Sea Scouts to sail on the local filled-in gravel pits, which we call the lagoons. And she was on her way home at about just after 4 o'clock on this October Saturday afternoon, and had to get to the road where she would have made her way home from. She had to go under a railway arch and up some steps, and there were 26 steps, so they were known as the ABC steps. And somebody saw her just after 4 o'clock, some boys on bicycles, and then she was found at about 12 minutes past 4 at the bottom of the steps, and she was dead. And she'd been stabbed several times. And at the inquest, the then coroner had the power to name a suspect if he felt that there was prima facie evidence against a particular person. So a man was named, Ian Bernard Spencer, because the coroner, Philip Gill, said that there was prima facie evidence against Ian Bernard Spencer. Well, clearly there wasn't, because at the pre-trial hearing in March, the case was thrown out because the magistrate said that there was insufficient evidence against Mr. Spencer. So Mr. Spencer was released and completely exonerated at that time. However, a lot of people still thought that he was the perpetrator. My mother never did. And one day in around about April or May in 1966, which was the year after Elsie died, we sat down at my mother's dining table and we wrote a letter to the local newspaper to say how pleased we were that Mr. Spencer had been released, and Mum didn't feel that he was guilty anyway. However, his name was still on the findings of the inquest, and they are still today. And Mr. Spencer lived with that shadow over him for the rest of his life. And he died very sadly in March, but at least the police had been to see him to tell him that they had another suspect, and there was really good evidence against this other man. And for the last, we had a memorial service, or rather we called it a tribute service for Elsie in 2015 on the 50th anniversary of her death. And with the help of the BBC and Eddie Mair and their investigative journalist John Mannell, West Yorkshire Police decided that they would look at the case again. And a very bright-eyed young policewoman officer spotted a name in the files, and after saying, "Oh, who's this?" it became apparent that this man was a major suspect, and he was still alive. And as a direct result of the work into the new inquiries into my sister's case, it was discovered that this man had committed several other nasty, nasty crimes. And in 1972, 5 years after my sister died, 7 years after Elsie died, he'd murdered another 14-year-old girl called Shirley Ann Baldy. And everything was pointing more and more towards this man. All the findings of the case were sent to the Crown Prosecution Service. They'd been drip-fed with the information anyway, but the whole complete file went to them last November, and they were deliberating on whether to charge this man, and the police were really keen for them to do so. And then he died in March, and we thought, my brother and I thought, that that was the end of everything. But we were told, no, you have sound reasons for having a new inquest. Now, the new inquest would do two things. It would take Ian Bernard Spencer's name off the findings, but what it would allow the police to do would be to make known all their findings against Peter Pickering, the man that was about to be charged. He had been arrested on suspicion of my sister's murder twice, and a new inquest means that we can reveal all their findings, which prove almost, sort of incontrovertibly that he was the murderer. So that's our objective at the moment. We're raising money through a brilliant organisation called Crowd Justice, which is run by lawyers and technical people who know about, websites and digital stuff. And they monitor all the fundraising, and they pass it on to your legal team. So we have a legal team, and we have a solicitor and a barrister, and they're working towards preparing a legal memorandum for us, which will be presented to the Attorney General. He will read the memorandum. If he thinks it's appropriate to have a new inquest, he will issue a fiat or an order to the chief coroner, and that will allow the chief coroner then to consider whether we should have a new inquest. So we're just at the stage at the moment of preparing the memorandum for the Attorney General, which will be handed to him sometime in the next few weeks. And we have our fingers crossed that he will say, yes, there is just reason here for a new inquest. Wow. And then it'll go to the chief coroner for his decision. So there's quite a lot hanging on what we're doing at the moment. It's really stressful. Yes. So, I mean, we feel as though we've done as much as we can do to get justice for our sister, because, completely innocent child, really. A child, okay. Yeah. Not doing anything but helping people. And to lose her life like that was just tragic. And we couldn't do anything while our parents were still alive because they were both distraught. Mum, I don't know whether it's a woman thing, but she was much more able to talk about my sister than my father was. And that's probably a man thing. And when my dad died in 2003, my brother and I discovered that a lot of the family documents had gone. We knew where they should be, but they weren't there. And we think that Dad had got rid of a lot of photographs, my sister's birth certificate and death certificate, all sorts of things, because he found them too painful to have close by him. He could have given them to me, but it still meant that he would have had to bring it all back and churn it all up again. So we think he just destroyed everything. So it was then that my brother and I decided we'd start looking for our roots again. And it was through doing family history research that we discovered the origins of the two families. And then in 2007, we'd been told originally when my sister died that she died instantly from one stab wound. And eventually in 2007, I plucked up courage and got her death certificate and was horrified to see that she'd died of multiple stab wounds. And then the police told us that she'd made her way after being stabbed from one end of the tunnel to the other. Okay. So, she hadn't died instantly. And that was a bit of a torture. That was a bit of a torture, not just for her, but, for us as well at the time. So we thought, well, if we'd been told that she'd died instantly from one stab wound and then discovered that that wasn't right, how much else was wrong? So that was when we decided we'd try and find out some answers. So we had a few hurdles because we discovered that all the documentation, all the files that were held by the National Archives were closed until 2033. So they close files like that while ever there are direct living relatives of the victim. So it was only through John Mannell and Eddie Mayer that we were able to find out as much as we did, and we had good responses from the director of the National Archives, and we'd just gone on from there. And then when Pickering died in March, we thought, well, we can't just stop now, there must be something else. So we had lots of encouragement from people like David Hinchliffe, who was the MP for Wakefield, and then now Mary Cray, who is the current MP for Wakefield. And we've had some very good advice from top line QCs. So we're soldiering on.
And are you able to say at all about why the Pickering case, when he was charged or on the line for it twice, why was that never pursued properly?
Well, that's only happened since 2015.
Oh, right, not before then, right, I see.
No, I mean, he's been in secure mental accommodation down the south of England in Berkshire for all the years since 1972, when he was arrested and charged with the murder of Shirley Ann Baldy, because he was seen. But he'd committed a lot of offences before that, including a rape and kidnap that he'd been charged. He was charged with a rape and kidnap as a direct result of the inquiries into Elsie's murder. So that happened in March, and he was found guilty. And 5 days later, I was on holiday with my friend Anne. We were down in Cumbria, and I had a phone call from the police to say Pickering's dead. And that was 5 days after he'd been found guilty. They hadn't even given him his he told him what his punishment would be. So we never got that kind of justice at that point. So that was quite devastating. Well, that was difficult. Quite ruined the holiday for a while. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking about that. I appreciate how very difficult that is. So thank you so much. I was going to ask how you've come to study over the last few years. Why you've chosen in the later part of your life to become academically. You were always academically inclined, I can tell by your line of work. But what led you to this?
Well, the year that the Open University was founded, which is 50 years ago. Well, just go back a little bit further than that. I only ever went to secondary modern school. Right. And so I failed my 11 plus twice, because in those days, if you took your 11 plus and passed the first half, you went on to do the second half. If you failed the second half, they would let you sit the first half again and give you a second chance. And I failed the first half. I passed the first half the first time, failed the second part, but then I got the chance to do the first part again and failed that. I always thought that I could do better. I mean, the teachers were always saying to me, could do better. So I thought I could do better. But I went to a very, very good secondary modern school. It was a brand new school, and a marvellous set of teachers, and learned so much from my English master, who was, I still think of him with affection.
That's brilliant.
Peter Spencer, his name was. Just a little apocryphal story there is that it was Peter Spencer who first introduced me to Shakespeare. And he said, right class, we're going to do Romeo and Juliet. And he allocated all the parts of parts to pupils in the class. And I felt lucky because I got the part of nurse.
Excellent.
And we were all waiting to see who was going to be Juliet.
Yeah. Oh, nurse is a much more interesting character.
Certainly. But we were all sitting there on tenterhooks wondering which girl was going to be Juliet. And he said, that just leaves Juliet. I'm going to do Juliet. And he was a big man with a baritone voice.
Fantastic.
And he spoke Juliet's part in a falsetto voice. And it was, and it was hilariously funny. Brilliant. But I've loved Romeo and Juliet ever since. Anyway, left school, no qualifications, went to night school, got quite a few O-levels, including English language and English literature, and I did a few other things as well. And then when the OU was inaugurated, I decided I would apply and do an art history course. Well, it wasn't to be for various reasons, which I don't need to go into. So in 2009, I was twitching because we'd sold the business, or most of it, and I just didn't feel as though I had any intellectual challenges anymore. So Colin said, well, why don't you go back to the Open University and start that again? So I applied, and I decided I would do a Bachelor of Arts degree. So the target was to get my BA before I was 70.
Brilliant.
So I did work hard, I did apply myself, and I got first class honours.
Oh, yeah, Beezer. Well done.
So then,
Much better than me.
after that, the OU invited me to do an MA.
Oh,
and so I did the BA in literature in English, so it included German and French and Scandinavian. But it was literature in English. And so I did that. But then when I went on to do my MA, it was English. And that was all through the time when Colin was really ill. And I had lots of opportunity for studying because I would sit with Colin and read to him from my study books. And I read to the children at Ulver Primary School now on a regular basis. So he was very encouraging, and I'm glad that I actually got my master's degree before he died. So that was nice. So
what did you do your master's thesis on? What was your choice?
Well, it's a funny one because it was about Merlin.
Yes. Well, we talked about this.
Yes, it was really to do with the medieval belief in the magician.
Yeah.
And Merlin is everybody knows about Merlin, and
everyone claims Merlin as well.
I mean, Merlin was born under Dumbarton Rock.
Yeah, he was born backwards, so that he aged from old man to...
I mean, that's T.H. White. There was all sorts of wonderful... I mean, the research for doing the Merlin thing was just fantastic. It was amazing.
Excalibur is among my favourite films of all time. The Charm of Making, and I'll nothing to me, it's like, it's one of these wee things. And apparently it was referenced in Ready Player One, the new science fiction movie by Steven Spielberg recently as well.
There you go. Yeah. There's always going to be a reference either to Excalibur or to Arthur or to Merlin.
So archetypal, isn't it? Something.
Yes, but I mean, the interesting thing was that in doing the research into Merlin, I ended up doing a lot of research into Arthur as well, and into Arthurian legend and
Arthur Ducks Below Him and so on.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And Cumbria plays a big part.
Yeah, Cumbria, Galic's long gone as well. That's the extraordinary thing, even though the place names are there. But have you got Alistair Moffat's The Lost Kingdoms at all?
Yes.
I think that's apart from that big green one I recommended on Arthur, and that's my favourite, I think, because it's.
I got that one after your recommendation, so really, really enjoyed it. And I think the fact that I enjoyed doing the research so much, and I had a wonderful tutor.
Yeah.
And he was so encouraging. He kept saying to me, "But what about so and so? And you could do this. And what about so and so?"
Do you know there's a Shakespeare play about Merlin? There's I don't have the text of it, but it was like it's Thomas Kidd and Shakespeare, or like Shakespeare and another writer, although it's never been credited formally to him. It might be Middleton, someone like that. And Shakespeare did. It was called. Is it called the Lives of Merlin or something like that? I'll find that out for you.
That would be interesting.
Because I remember a rehearsed reading of it at the tramway when I was a student in 1997, I think it was. It was quite unusual because that's Shakespeare. Merlin, Arthurian, what?
Well, it was, it was only 200 years. Shakespeare was only writing 200 years after Merlin's, assumed lifespan. So he would have been and he would have been a good subject for Shakespeare, for any of the writers then.
I love in Excalibur, Nicol Williamson's performance of Merlin. It's just, he's so hammy, but he's enjoying it so much, and I just love him. A great Brechtian actor as well. But I was going to ask about when you did your degree, you're saying you did Scandinavian literature. What Scandinavian literature did you study?
Who wrote The Doll's House?
Ibsen.
Yes.
Henry Gibson.
No, The Doll's House. Yes.
Henrik Ibsen, but yes. They used to call him Henry Gibson.
Henry Gibson, that's right. Yeah, Henrik Ibsen. Yes, and so much stuff. Yes, and 19th century French literature as well, which was good. Loads and loads of wonderful stuff about women who work down coal mines. Bare-breasted, pushing the coal trolleys along. Oh, fascinating stuff. Yeah, and I think that the 19th century lit module was my favourite.
Really, why? Why do you think?
The writers wrote from the heart, and they were very creative. Everybody, but all founded in what their beliefs were. Right down to Dickens, who experienced, childhood poverty himself. When he was sent to the blacking factory when his father was incarcerated for bad debts. And he became passionate about it. And everybody who wrote then were passionate about whatever it was that they were doing. Yeah. I remember being in a play once, which was a Victorian melodrama, but I got sacked because I couldn't scream properly. Aww. I had to scream because I discovered a body behind a settee, and the drama teacher kept saying to me, "For goodness sake, Frost, scream, will you?" And I couldn't. I used to utter a little "ah!" And he said in the end, "Oh, go away, girl, you can't," So
the thing with Victoria, like melodrama of that period, it's about the audience. Like it's about really committing to the audience and communicating with them way back, and everything was so much more heightened. The type of acting they used to use was something called the art of representation. Amongst many systems, there were kind of different ways of doing things, but the art of representation was this classified series of gestures that would, let you feel. It's extraordinary stuff. Yes, indeed. So two last little questions. The first of which was, how have you seen Mull change in the years since you've come here, since 1997?
Well, tourism's taken off in a big way. It used to be fishing, forestry and farming to a huge extent. You never talk about anybody in Mull because they're always related to somebody else, so yes, yeah. Another good thing is never to say a Gaelic name until you hear somebody else say it.
Oh, that's quite good. Yeah. Do you know the mistake someone made somewhere? It has to be true. I want it to be true, which is they bought a house down by the shore and said, we'd like to call it House of the Boats, and they sort of worked it out, and they spelt it wrong, they misheard it, and they had it as Taina Botan instead of Taina Batan. Unfortunately, Taina Botan means House of the Penises.
Ah, very good. Yeah. Well, that's not inappropriate either, according to... Yeah.
Well, indeed. So the tales go.
So tourism's taken off in a big way, and we work very hard in Holiday Mall to try and extend the tourist season into the shoulder months, with a degree of success, because there were things like the food festival and the rally and music festival that we tried to incorporate into the tourist year. But now there's a huge influx of people like me who are not Scots, and people see this. Someone once said to me, "You think you've found your Shangri-La, don't you?" And I said, well, I haven't. I don't just think I found my Shangri-La. I have found my Shangri-La, because for both Colin and I, the best thing that we ever did was to come to Mull, and we only would ever leave feet first. But the island is busy, lots of new building, it's becoming very vibrant, lots of things happening, and the question of what do you do in the winter is a silly question, really, because winter time, after the tourists have gone home, is when that island comes to life. And there are dinner dances and parties and ceilidhs and get-togethers of all kinds, and it's just an absolutely wonderful place to be.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Anne. I really appreciate your time. Well, it's that time of year here when the light starts to disappear and the mornings just get darker and darker and darker. It's a time for currying doon, or even currying in. Not curry on its own. Curry on its own does not exist. Curry in or curry doon. What is this nonsense that people talk of? Anyway, it's time for making the most of all the books and films you've stockpiled over the summer. This weekend sees Halloween parties across the island. We'll be going to Dervig tomorrow night for our Halls party. Call will be going as the Lego Batman Joker, which George has spent the last couple of days working on, and it looks fantastic. I'm going to sneak out and nip along the road to Ambierling for their schnitzel dinner, which rounds off their season. I can't wait. It's always a highlight for me. And then after that, there's tunes to be had at the Bella Croy, our local pub in Dervig, with Hector McFadgen on the box. Hector's one of the best box players you can hear, a great musician, and a colosach as well, which is great. And people ask us, what do you do in the winter? As these podcasts take quite a lot of time to make, I'm looking to fundraise through donations and sponsorship. So if you feel like it and are able to, please feel free to donate the cost of a cup of coffee or even a sausage roll, wherever you may be, through the website. You'll see a donate tab there where you can donate if you so wished. If you're a business and would like to sponsor an episode, please feel free to drop me a line anytime. But don't worry if you can't or you don't want to sponsor or donate. I'd much rather that you listened than you didn't. And I'd like to say hello and thank you to the men of the Mull 72 Club who had me along for dinner the other evening. It was a delight to be in your company. Thank you. And to those of you who have reached out to say hello again, thank you. It's always great to hear from you. There's plenty more to come. I recorded an interview with a good friend just the other day, and then I'm off to Tob on Monday to talk to a gentleman that a few people have been asking me to track down, so I'm delighted about that. You can follow the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud and TuneIn Radio. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and through our website on www.whatwedointhewinter.com. And a wee message for Frankie in Norway. I hope your recovery is swift and that the doctors are of the medical type and not interstellar wanderers from the planet of Gallifrey. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Shinu, Morning Dang.